Okay, welcome everybody. I hope everybody's days are going well so far. Today, we are going to talk about the topic of the Trail of Tears. Now, this is a very depressing topic, very sad. We're going to see some images and hear some things that you wouldn't necessarily want to hear other, humans experiencing, but this is a really necessary part of our history and it's something that, definitely did happen. So that's why we need to learn about it. So before we jump right in, I want you to think for a minute about everything we've talked about this year so far, especially with Native Americans and the United States, and even before the United States government, when it was Britain and France, and North America was split up between those empires, or those major global superpowers. What type of relationship the Native Americans had with those types of people? The Spanish had a chunk of the country. So, think about everything we've talked about so far, because this is all going to keep culminating into the Trail of Tears. And even we're going to go beyond the Trail of Tears today with, we're going to bring it right up until 2022. So think about that for a minute. We definitely have some tension in between the Native Americans and between the United States government over land, particularly. I know we've discussed that in the past. So just keep that in the back of your head as we jump into discussing this. So today, our objective is going to be to understand how conflict between the Native Americans and the United States government, particularly the Indian Removal Act of 1830, impacted the growth and development of the United States. So we are going to watch this short video on Andrew Jackson's presidency. He was president at the time of the Indian Removal Act, and you'll hear about that briefly in this video, but this will give you an overview of his whole presidency and the type of president he was.
In 1835, someone tried to shoot Andrew Jackson. The president, who was 67, beat the guy senseless with his cane. You don't mess with Andrew Jackson. Born in 1767 in the Carolinas, Jackson grew up poor and tough as nails. He made a fortune in Tennessee as a lawyer and a landowner, then became a national hero in 1815 by whooping the British as the general at the Battle of New Orleans. He won the presidency in 1828, and he changed everything. Jackson believed the president was the direct representative of the common man. Like Thomas Jefferson, he wanted to keep the federal government weak and let the states have their say. Unlike Jefferson, he thought the best way to do that was a strong president. Earlier presidents vetoed bills only when they were unconstitutional. Jackson vetoed bills he didn't like. He blocked infrastructure projects, dismantled the National Bank, and replaced government employees with political friends. He went against the Supreme Court and had the Native Americans removed from their land in the South. He also took on his own Vice President John Calhoun over tariffs. Enemies called him King Andrew and formed the Whig Party to take him on. Jackson left office in 1837, but he changed politics forever. And if you try to stay different, the ghost of Andrew Jackson will kick your you-know-what.
Okay, so we're going to start off with what was known as the Indian problem. And notice the quotation marks. You can come up with if you think this was actually, a problem or not. The United States government and Andrew Jackson definitely thought so. So white Americans, particularly those who lived on the western frontier, often feared and resented the Native Americans they encountered. To them, American Indians seemed to be an unfamiliar, alien people who occupied land that white settlers wanted and believed they deserved. Some officials believed that the best way to deal with the Indians was to civilize them. So their goal, and also what civilize means, is to make them as much like white Americans as possible, meaning their language, meaning their religion, their clothes, their education, etc. So they wanted the Native Americans to basically throw away everything they knew, everything they believed in, and everything that they had been practicing for so long and turn into white Americans. And if you remember anything that we've learned about Native Americans in the past, the differences are a lot. They don't have the same religion. They don't practice Christianity. They have their own language, their own way of educating people, and education is different in general. Indians weren't as big, at least in this time and in general, on educating children on, how to necessarily, of course, read and write English, but even do some more tasks like how to sew or how to cook in what white Americans cooked in a kitchen and stuff like that. Indians, Native Americans, their education was verbal, first of all. Their stories, their traditions was passed down verbally, as well as they believed, in teaching children how to hunt, how to fish, how to survive. Indian lifestyle was so different from white Americans, and that is exactly what scared white Americans. People say that we have fears, humans in general have fears of what is different than us. If we don't know something or we don't have things planned out, that we're scared of it, scared of the unknown. And the Native Americans were a gigantic unknown. And instead of getting to know the Native Americans and learn about them, and of course, you can cite times in history where people have done just that. But overall, instead of getting to know them and learn about them, they wanted to change them. So, in your own words, or even taking snippets from this slide, please in your notebook write down some of the key points that we have just discussed so far. I'm going to give you just a minute or two to do that. Just jot down some of the key points that you've taken so far. Okay, so it's been roughly 2 minutes. So you'll just finish up and we'll move on. So, the U.S. government's relationship with Native Americans. So, we're going to go over this article. Okay, so you'll all have this article in front of you. I handed it out at the beginning of class. So, if you just want to take it out, and as we go through, as we read this together, if you would annotate or highlight or underline key points in this. Again, we were talking about Native Americans' relationship with the US government, and this is going to kind of refresh your memory and maybe give you some new information about this. So I'm going to read. As I read, I want you to annotate. I know we've done a lot of annotations, and you know what that means. So annotate, highlight, underline, just talk to the text as we go through this. So The history of relations between Native Americans and the federal government of the United States has been fraught, so it has not been good. To many Native Americans, the history of European settlement has been a history of wary welcoming, followed by opposition, defeat, near extinction, and now a renaissance. To Europeans and Americans, it has included everything from treatment of Native American nations as equals or near equals to assimilation meaning bringing the Native Americans, getting rid of their culture and assimilating them or joining them into the white American culture, to exile, to near genocide, often simultaneously. So in the late 18th century, many Native American tribes allied with the British during the Revolutionary War. However, the Treaty of Paris, which ended the war, was silent on the fates of these British allies. The new United States government was thus free to acquire Native American lands by treaty or force. Resistance from the tribes stopped the encroachment of settlers, at least for a while. Treaty making. After the Revolutionary War, the United States maintained the British policy of treaty making with the Native American tribes. In general, the treaties were to define the boundaries of Native American lands and to compensate for the taking of lands. Often, however, the treaties were not ratified by the Senate and thus were not necessarily deemed enforceable by the U.S. government, leaving issues unresolved. On occasion, the representatives of Native American tribes who signed the treaties were not necessarily authorized under tribal law to do so. For example, William McIntosh, chief of the Muskogee Creek Nation, was assassinated for signing the Treaty of Indian Springs in violation of Creek law. Treaty making as a whole ended in 1871, when Congress ceased to recognize the tribes as entities capable of making treaties. So Congress was no longer going to sign treaties or make treaties. They didn't recognize any of these tribes as like political bodies or their own people able to make treaties. The value of the treaties also came to be called into question when the Supreme Court decided in 1903 Congress had full power over Native American affairs and could override treaties. Many of the treaties before then, however, remained in force at least to some extent, and the Supreme Court was occasionally asked to interpret them. One notable treaty with ongoing repercussions is the Treaty of Fort Laramie of 1868. Under that treaty, the United States pledged, among other things, that the Great Sioux or Lakota Reservation, including the Black Hills, would be set apart for the absolute and undisturbed use and occupation of the Lakota Nation. Although neither side fully complied with the treaty's terms, with the discovery of gold in the area, the United States sought to buy back the Black Hills. The Lakota rejected the offer, resulting in the Black Hills War, which included Custer's last stand at the Battle of Little Bighorn. Finally, in 1877, Congress went back on the original treaty and passed an act reclaiming the Black Hills. In 1923, the Lakota sued. 60 years later, the Supreme Court determined the annulment was a taking under the Fifth Amendment and that the tribe was owed just compensation, plus interest starting from 1877. The tribe had refused to accept payment, however, and is still seeking return of the land. As of 2018, the amount due appears to be around $1 billion. Removal and resettlement. Although conflicts were fought in the Northwest Territories, like Tecumseh and the Battle of Tippecanoe, and the Southeast, the Creek War and the Seminole Wars, the major policy toward the North American tribes in the early part of the 19th century was removal and resettlement. The Removal Act of 1830, which is what we are going to discuss more in depth today, authorized by President Andrew Jackson to negotiate for the removal and resettlement of Native American tribes. A primary target was the Cherokee, the Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole from Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Florida. Although the removal and resettlement was supposed to be voluntary, so means that they were supposed to just ask, even beg, and the Native Americans were supposed to have the option to say yes or no. Ultimately, it resulted in the series of forcible removals known as the Trail of Tears. Allotment and assimilation. For most of the middle part of the 19th century, the U.S. government pursued a policy known as allotment and assimilation. Pursuant to treaties, they were often forced upon tribes. Common reservation land was allotted to individual families. The General Allotment Act, or the Dawes Act of 1887, made this more general, which resulted in the loss of much reservation land. A new approach was undertaken during the New Deal under President Franklin D. Roosevelt with the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934, which ended allotment, banned further sale of Native American land, and returned some lands to the tribes. After World War II, however, proposals arose in favor of assimilation, termination of tribes, and an end to reservations. A number of reservations, such as the Menominee in Wisconsin and the Klamath in Oregon, had their reservations terminated. So we are going to stop there because we will get into more current stuff later in our presentation. So I'm just going to bring us back. Okay, so this is a timeline of everything that we are going to cover today. So you'll see we start in 1830 with the Indian Removal Act. By the winter of 1831, the Choctaw are expelled from their land. In 1832, we have the court case Worcester versus Georgia. In 1836, the Creeks are driven from their land for the last time. In 1838, the Cherokees are driven from their land. Again, we saw in that article all of these different tribes where it's targeted, so we'll see the different years that happened. We're going to then go into the 1869 Indian boarding schools, and I thought this was important, because it goes along with the idea of civilization, of assimilation, and it also, we had a really popular, I shouldn't say popular, but a big boarding school in Pennsylvania, actually, and so it might connect you guys more to the state, since that is, of course, where we are right now. And then we're going to go into 1907, when Oklahoma becomes a state. As we go through and as we learn before we get to that part, try to think of why Oklahoma becoming a state would have such an effect on the Native Americans. And then we jump all the way to 2020, because I want you guys to see that things with the Native Americans are not over. They're not all the way in the past. This didn't happen, hundreds and hundreds of years ago. We still have court cases where the government is still ruling on Native American land, people cases, the powers of the states versus the government on Indian lands. So we had a court case in 2020 and in 2022 that kind of ties everything in. And I think that's really important to note, that this stuff is still going on in some way or another today. So we start off with the Indian Removal Act. This gave the federal government the power to exchange native-held land in the East for land in the West. So that video and the article went over the article more so, went over how Jackson wanted the land in the Southeast, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, etc. He wanted to take that from the Native Americans, and he wanted to keep that for the white Americans, for farmers. What was in the Southeast? Why would Jackson want the land in the Southeast so badly? Let's just think about it for a minute. Think about the weather. Think about the economy in the Southeast versus the Midwest or, the middle of the state or of the countries, I mean. Okay, does anybody want to answer why Jackson would want the land in the Southwest or in the Southeast? Why he would want to move them west? Yes, perfect. So the answer was that the land in the Southeast was where cotton was being grown. The Southeast was big for cotton products. We've talked about slavery, we've talked about plantations, and that was the economy, the big economy, a plantation economy in the Southeast. And Jackson wanted more of that land for the white Americans to profit on, to, export so that we could import other goods, so that we could have the money to trade, etc. So that land in the Southeast was good for the farming, for the plantations, and that's what Jackson wanted. It was an article that I read, they called it a cotton kingdom, was the places where the Native Americans were settled. So now we move into Jackson's disobedience. So the law required the government to negotiate removal treaties fairly, voluntarily, and peacefully. It did not permit the president or anyone else to coerce or to force the Native Americans, or to basically torture them, or do different things to them to make them move. It did not permit anyone to coerce Native nations into giving up their ancestral lands. However, President Jackson and his government frequently ignored the letter of the law and forced Native Americans to vacate lands they had lived on for generations. So think about you living in your house. Maybe your parents bought that house, maybe you're second generation in that house. But I think there are a lot of people around here even that might be living with their grandparents or in homes that their grandparents lived in or that their great-grandparents lived in. People I've found, especially in the area of this school, tend to, buy homes and pass it down from, generation to generation. Imagine if somebody just came in and they just took it. They said, you have to move. We're forcing you out of your home. We want this home. We want it for the government or for other people that are not you. That's, in a sense, what was happening. So now the Trail of Tears, the big, what this lesson is about. In the winter of 1831, under threat of invasion by the U.S. Army, the Choctaw became the first nation to be expelled from its land altogether. They made the journey to Indian Territory on foot, some bound in chains, and marched double file, and without any food, supplies, or other help from the government. Thousands of people died along the way. It was, one Choctaw leader told an Alabama newspaper, a trail of tears and death. So let's again take a pause for about 2 minutes and jot down in your notes some important things that you have learned or that we covered in the last couple minutes, in the last couple slides. Of course, you're going to keep that article for your reference and all of the notes on your article, so you don't have to rewrite down stuff from that article. That article is yours, but anything from the last couple slides, just jot down some notes and ideas. Okay, just another 30 seconds or so. Okay, so we're going to move on. So now we come to this Worcester versus Georgia, this court case. So state governments joined in an effort to drive Native Americans out of the South. Several states passed laws limiting Native American sovereignty and rights and encroaching on their territory. The U.S. Supreme Court objected to these practices and affirmed that Native nations were sovereign nations in which the laws of Georgia and other states can have no force. So a sovereign nation, that would mean a self-governing body. So that the Native Americans are not part of Georgia. They are not part of the United States of America. They might live in the land around the United States of America or around Georgia or in where the United States has said Georgia would be, but they are a self-governing body. They make their own rules. They have their own sort of justice system, a way to make sure that everybody follows the rules, etc. The maltreatment, though, continued. As President Andrew Jackson noted in 1832, if no one intended to enforce the Supreme Court's rulings, which he certainly did not, then the decision would fall stillborn. So that means that if the Supreme Court, if their rulings, if nobody enforced it, meaning that if Jackson did not make people follow it, if Jackson's administration, if the other members of the government, of his branches of government did not make people enforce it, if any sort of law enforcement or any sort of people on the ground in these states did not make people follow it, then the ruling would just fall short. It would just go away. It would, nothing would happen. And that's exactly what Andrew Jackson wanted. He didn't want to follow what the Supreme Court said. He did not have any intention of making people follow the Supreme Court's rulings. So what does this tell you about Andrew Jackson? Think about anything you know about the President of the United States, any of them, and what their role is in the government and about all of the branches of government and how they work together. Yes. Perfect. Exactly. So Andrew Jackson, of course, is not following the law. And if we know anything about presidents, it's that the president is never above the law. The president is supposed to honestly be the best role model of the law. He's supposed to stand behind the law